Middle East, a modern name for a region shaped by millennia of conflict and faith. From the Crusades to the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, its history is marked by sacred visions and imperial designs. And we understand its present shape by studying its layered past.
I'm here with British historian and writer Peter Frankopan, author to The Silk Roads, among other bestsellers. And we're going to talk about the rise and fall of the Byzantine Empire. In your other great book, The First Crusade, you describe how you first fell in love with this period of history. You went to a lecture over 30 years ago and were, quote, alert and transfixed as if given a triple espresso. Why this instant fascination?
Well, it's at the beginning of my last year at university, and I'd met a woman that morning who then became my wife. So it was obviously, I was in the mood to fall in love. But I went to a lecture by a brilliant professor who explained the role of the world centered on the great city of Constantinople. And in the course of the next hour, I heard about the role that Baghdad played in connections of trade, also religious competition. I heard about the importance of Sicily as the wheel on which the Mediterranean turns, which I'd never thought about. For me, the Mediterranean meant the south of France or maybe, the nice coasts of Italy, rather than how Sicily was so important. I heard about North Africa and how that integrated into connections, cultural and otherwise. I heard about Scandinavians coming down the Russian and Ukrainian river systems to the Black Sea to trade, even Icelandic sagas writing about the great city of Constantinople. And I think I thought two different things. First, I thought, wow, this sounds amazing to connect lots of parts of the world I knew something about. I used to spend a lot of time growing up in Småland and coming to Stockholm. I spent a lot of time learning Russian when I was younger. I learned Arabic at school. And so lots of strands all came together. And I thought, this sounds and feels amazing. But it was the second thing that was probably the most important one, which is these stories felt that they were really significant. They were really important. And yet I'd never heard of them. I'd never had anything about these different regions in the history I learnt at school. And this was at the beginning of the 1990s, where the Soviet Union had just fallen apart. That whole world waking up in Central Asia, in the Middle East, in China and so on. There was a whole new spectrum. So it set up a whole new subject that I thought, this is what I want to do. And if you fall in love with something or with someone, work isn't hard. You are very motivated. So I was very lucky to have this particular experience and epiphany that day.
Mm. And let's do Byzantium for beginners now. When Rome fell in the 5th century, the eastern part centered around Constantinople. It continued for another millennium, which is actually one of the great success stories of history. What was the secret behind this endurance?
Well, look, first, some of my colleagues don't talk to each other because when did Rome fall? Did Rome fall? What does fall mean? So, capturing that in a 10-hour lecture is hard.
They're not here now.
No, but you'll get angry emails. I mean, look, what happens in the beginning of the 5th century is that you have pressure put on the Western provinces that lead to the collapse of infrastructure and networks. And there are lots of different reasons that happens. Disruption to big systems is much less complicated but more damaging than we think. So small knocks can destroy big things. If you're driving at 80 miles an hour, or here in Sweden, 70 miles an hour, and in a very expensive Mercedes, if a screw that costs 50 cents goes wrong, your car is valueless and you die. What happens in the East is the great city of Constantinople was founded in the year 330 by the Emperor Constantine. It's called New Rome. It has the same apparatus of government as Rome. And Rome is so big, it's so powerful, that it runs across these two different centers of government. And as the Western provinces become less important, Rome itself becomes depopulated. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, is the nickname given to it quite soon. Trumpopolis, I suppose it would be called today, city of Trump, starts to become the only centre of power. And it survives from 330 until 1453, when it's occupied by the Ottoman Turks. And that period for running 1,000 years is unique in European history. In fact, it's unique in global history. There are other empires that have come close, but that tells you that you should be looking for the clues about what is it that makes survivability, flexibility, and resilience work. And these are quite important questions for our world today. That I think is why history is so exciting to so many people today. It's not just about the stories of the past, it's what can we learn for the present.
And I think in the Silk Roads, you write a lot about the Persian Empire. Part of its success was also its openness to ideas and practices from the outside. Was that similar with the Byzantine Empire, would you say?
I mean, it's not wrong, but it's very easy to be open when you're rich. You know, I think that's the bottom line. And although I wouldn't think of myself as an economic historian, you know, it starts from what capabilities do you have? What kind of institutions do you have? What kind of quality of life? And it stands to reason that if you're able to satisfy basic requirements like food and water, energy, if you're able to have institutions that seem to be meritocratic, more or less, then you get co-option from larger parts of the population. And I think places that are successful, it's not that the people who live there happen to be nicer or happen to be more complicated. Something's to do with geography. Where do you sit alongside great trade routes? What is your geographic envelope that you sit in? What is your climatological and environmental pressure? But I think good systems of government are what matter. And, you know, not really surprising to think justice and law play an important part. And probably the thing that Rome is most famous for over the last 400 or 500 years in the Western European tradition has been the role of Roman law. I mean, in fact, in my university, we called the study of law jurisprudence until about 30 years ago. You know, we still center European laws on laws that, in fact, mostly are those of Theodosius and the Emperor Justinian. So typically we think of them as Byzantine emperors. But those I think structures matter. It's not that people are more inclined to be better or worse. It's about those legacies of institutional
material and
sophistication.
Forces.
And if you're able to recycle assets amongst people who deserve them. One of the keys that's very different to my side of Europe, to Western Europe, is that when Europe in the West starts to grow again, you start to have kings and barons and the church, and their job is to grab assets and keep them away from others. And that looks very different in the parts of the world I work on.
And the term Byzantine Empire was actually coined much later. So how did the self-image of these Eastern Romans evolve?
It's a great question. I mean, the ancient city is called Byzantium, so that's why the word comes from here. It then turns into New Rome, then Constantinople, and then in the 1920s it's changed into what's today Istanbul. So when you start talking about New Rome or Constantinople or the Byzantine Empire, it's about trying to claim where your history is. So these people who I'm talking about think of themselves and they call themselves Romans. There's no Byzantine Empire. They sometimes use Byzantium as a kind of, that we've been here a long time. But these are not continuers or part of the Roman Empire. These are Roman emperors who trace their line back to Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and they trace their line back to Rome in the Republic. And I think that's a very interesting question about how those histories then get framed by others. And one of the reasons why Byzantium and the Byzantines get renamed from outside is because that's a way of claiming the legacy of Rome for others. So the Holy Roman Empire, the ways in which rulers in the West start to model themselves on Roman emperors. The fact that in my city of Oxford, where I know you know well, we have British aristocrats in the 1800s wearing togas to look like Romans. So that competition to claim the legacy of Rome means that you've got to push other people out of the way. So the name Byzantine doesn't just get used, but it gets used very negatively. So in Swedish, as in English, Byzantine is a negative thing. A government that's Byzantine means it's over-elaborate. It means it's smoke and mirrors. It means it's inefficient. And that looks very different to the reality and looks very different to how these Romans or Byzantines.
And you think that's unfair, that it's sort of a metaphor for stale bureaucracy, Byzantine?
I'd probably be trying to think about what works. History, how we teach it in the West, it's a bit like teaching people how to get married. You study divorces. History is about revolutions. It's about warfare. It's about a catastrophe. That's our Western European legacy. And maybe that's part of the reasons why we're highly competitive. That's probably quite good when we get to the World Cup in football, quite good when we come to tennis. We're very good at competing. And, you don't tend to have people from India, from China winning Wimbledon or winning World Cups, except in maybe cricket. But so I think that there is a degree to which it's unfair, but you can't control those narratives. And, I'm not here to fight the Byzantines' corner. I think it's just interesting how history gets relabeled. I mean, this is normal as well. So I've come here from England, where we use the word Anglo-Saxon to somehow connect us to, in fact, to Germanic tribes. That is complicated if you're British. We don't talk about the Norman conquest and the British being actually French. And in fact, the Normans are from Scandinavia. And so those overlayers are, it doesn't matter whether it's fair. It's just, as Thomas Aquinas says, it's quod est. It's what it is. But I think it's interesting that the denigration of that side of our European continent is also reflected in the present day. So most people listening to this know exactly what's going on in British politics with Macron, with Pedro Sanchez in Spain. But most people cannot tell you who the current leader or prime minister of Bulgaria or Romania, or who the minister of culture is in Greece. No one can name a Eastern European political figure from the last 100 years or a cultural figure. Maybe with Chopin as the one exception. So I think it does have a legacy. So it does matter, because what it does by saying Byzantine and not Roman is that the west of Europe, the rich part, it matters, and the eastern side doesn't. And again, we're talking where the eastern side of Europe is under a huge amount of military pressure because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that rehabilitation, it's important that people like me come and talk at events like this to try to explain why these reputations have been made.
And the case in point when it comes to relabeled, rebranded history is, of course, the Crusades, which, according to tradition, was launched by the Pope and then culminated with the conquest of Jerusalem. But you tell a different story in your great book, starting in Constantinople. So tell us what actually happened there.
Well, the Pope was central. So I'm not a revisionist for the sake of it. But let's do it this way, right? If you were to ask someone, why did these great armies start to leave Europe to head for Jerusalem? Most people have heard that story. They know what the Crusades are. In today's postmodern world, we say, well, these are religious zealots. People were trying to go and protect the holy sites where Jesus Christ was born, where he died, where he had his resurrection, right? And it would be reasonable to think that this happens in 1095, the call from the Pope. Most people, if you say, when are these sites conquered? Why is there a sudden response of Western Europe? You think it must have happened. There must have been something's gone wrong 1 or 2 years beforehand. Jerusalem falls to the Arab armies of the supporters of Muhammad 450 years earlier. Right? So it's a bit like if we gathered in Sweden to say, we're now going to put right, not even Gustav Vasa, he's much more recent. We're going to put right the Elizabethans and the Tudors.
It might happen sometime.
You never know. Never know. I mean, exactly. Never rule anything out. But the sequence is that the story of the Crusades, of course, is the story about the power of the church to encourage knights to serve God through military means. That's what the Crusades becomes. And that's how it becomes so popular. So the question is, why does it happen then? One of the problems about that story is that all of the sources are written in Latin, and most medieval scholars only read Latin texts. But there are vast amounts of material in medieval Greek or Byzantine Greek, medieval Greek, in Armenian, in Hebrew, in Arabic, Syriac, that tell you something slightly different, which is there is a compression point in the immediate few years before the Pope gets involved. The church at that time is divided into a schism between the Orthodox and the Catholics. And the Crusade is an opportunity for the Emperor in Constantinople and the Pope in Rome to unite the two Romes together and to create a single Christian entity, whereby the Emperor needs manpower. And he enlists the Pope to deliver large numbers of military men, and it's specifically military men to take out big targets like the city of Nicaea, the city of Antioch, and Jerusalem itself. And through the process of the expedition, the role that the emperor plays and the Byzantines or the Romans play is absolutely central. And the Crusaders find themselves against all of the odds. It's one of the great stories in history of survival against, again, time and again, cheating defeat at the last moment. And it's spectacular success. The Crusaders are left in the Holy Land thinking, how do we now run this? And do we justify taking these cities for ourselves? Are we holding them for the Pope? Are we holding them for the Emperor? And those stories about where Rome gets rebranded as Byzantium, as unreliable, all trace themselves to the Crusades. But it's 1,000 years of an insistent story told for lots of obvious reasons that a small correction can mean you don't have to say everybody else is wrong, but you have much better way, I think, of explaining why there's a response, because there is a catastrophe that happens in the early 1090s that requires very large numbers of men, and they deliver what the emperor wants. So that comes at a long-term price in history.
But it ended up being a catastrophe for Constantinople as well. During the Fourth Crusade, it was sacked by the Crusaders in the year 1204.
You could do worse if you want to play. I mean, if you want to play that game, it ends worse for Christians. So Christians are the only people of a major global religion who don't control their own holy sites. Right? I mean, we'll see what happens in Jerusalem now with the confrontation that Israel and in Gaza and with Palestine. But the Christians let go of the Holy Land. The last push out was in 1291 with the siege of Acre. Since that time, for the last 800 years, we in England, we sing songs saying, let's build Jerusalem. What is our most famous hymn, more or less? Jerusalem, let's build them in Somerset. It's much easier to get to the green fields where people play cricket and have nice cucumber sandwiches. Christians all let go of that legacy. So it was a disaster for Constantinople. It got sacked in 1204.
And it never really recovered after the Crusades?
But it does recover. So it does another 250 years. And again, that might not sound like a lot, because when you look at the Middle Ages, 1204 until 1453, you think that's quite close. That's taking us from today back to before the American Revolution, right? That's a long time. So it might not have been quite so expensive, quite so nice, quite so great, but it is able to get up off the floor.
And it was definitely smaller in the end.
Yeah. And, the question is, with all things, is large territory a sign of success? So I suppose if we measure the same thing, is Sweden in the last 200 years, has this been a disaster where Sweden has lost Norway or let Norway go free? Norway now, with its sovereign wealth fund controlling 2% of every single quoted equity anywhere in the world.
We didn't know that at the time.
But nor did the Byzantines know that, in fact, to keep Constantinople secure, you probably need to have the manpower that supports your infrastructure. And in fact, what does for Constantinople and for the empire is not the rise of Turks or other pressures, it's the demographic collapse of the Black Death. In the 1340s, a disease gets spread, probably originating in Kyrgyzstan, spreading along through the Silk Roads, enabled by the Mongol Empire that allows huge movement of goods and people quickly. When that reaches the Mediterranean and spreads into all parts of Europe, including into to Sweden, we have these reports by priests in Västerås saying, if don't face the south wind, make sure you're naked when you say your prayers. Slightly crazy way of in pandemics to try to cope, but we always have crazy people in during pandemics suggesting solutions. Yeah. That decimation of the population in Byzantium means that the manpower,
about half the people of Constantinople, right?
Something like that. Some of my colleagues say maybe only a quarter, maybe half. But if you lose your manpower, then your ability to maintain your institutions becomes compromised. But even at the very last moment, as the Turks were outside, support from other parts of Europe could have saved Constantinople. This was still a big, significant city with some of the most important monuments in Europe and some of the most important relics.
So the end there in 1453 wasn't really inevitable, you think, when the Ottomans finally
in today's day and age, we're more compassionate how we think about change, and it's more popular now to think about what does that fall mean. The occupation by the Ottomans was bad for some people, for aristocrats. It was not great for all members of the church, but modus vivendi of respect for Orthodox clergy does carry on in some shape or form, and there are lots of continuities. The Ottomans reheat a lot of the Byzantine institutions. They adopt them. They use the same mechanics. And you could argue that 150, 200 years later, the Turks are starting to behave like Romans too, tracing their legacies back to Rome, back to Alexander the Great. So that those fusions come on top. So it depends how you measure success. I mean, again, I come from Britain. 120 years ago, Britain controlled a quarter of the world's empire. I mean, a quarter of the world's landmass. Now it doesn't. And of course, that's failure to some extent. But, you know, Britain is a nuclear power, G7 member, and is important institutionally. So it depends what you want to measure against. And I think that the story of the Eastern Roman or the Byzantine Empire is one that's very unforgiving, because people start with the fact that it doesn't work, rather than perhaps that 1,100 years plus is quite a good template to be seeing what does work.
Yeah, and also this conquest by the Ottomans. I mean, this Sultan Mehmed II, he made a point of walking in the footsteps of the old Romans, and culture had a revival under him in Constantinople. Is that story sort of lost on Europe, do you think?
I think that, speaking as an anthropologist, adopting and integrating and incorporating is a much better system of government than chopping people's heads off. So it's quite helpful to try to underline similarities if you're trying to accommodate and build alliances, rather than to use aggression. And aggression and force tend to lead to short-term gains, but long-term collapse or long-term losses. So it's not just that it's realpolitik, if this is a smart thing to do. It's a signal to say we're going to try to be inclusive. And yeah,
but our sort of popular narrative is still stuck in this East-West dichotomy.
My view is we don't have a narrative in the East. I mean, in Europe about the East, we don't know what it is. We don't know where it starts. We don't even know what Europe means. You know, does Europe mean, we figure Ukraine, but does it include some of Russia, all of Russia? Does it include some of Turkey, the European part? You know, where's the line? Is Georgia, is Armenia part of Europe? You know, we have Kazakhstan playing the European football championships. You know, Israel performs in Eurovision. I mean, these days in Eurovision, Australia performs. So these ideas about what Europe means in the East and the West, you know, in my world, I think what West means rich economies that are trying to keep their place in a changing world. It's a slightly different question to the Byzantines. Yeah. But I think our knowledge of anything that is east of Vienna is extremely poor. And it's not just about Turkey, Central Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. You know, 85% of the world's population are not in the West.
And hence your crusade in this book, where you try to sort of put Central Asia in the middle of world history. And you, I think you call the Crusades a sort of a sideshow compared to the Mongol expansion, for instance.
I mean, look, from a point of view of Christian history and church history, it's hugely important. From the point of view of the legacies of what's happening today in the Middle East, of the competition for holy sites, for interventions, of course, extremely important and significant 1,000 years on. But, you know, if you're looking at what the main story in global affairs is, probably in the Middle Ages, rather than thinking about 10,000, 20, 30, 40,000 men on horses going to Jerusalem, one might be thinking at the same period, what does the Sung dynasty look like in China? This great empire of the Chola in Southeast Asia, the Pagan empire in what's now Burma. You know, you see these, you know, the Abbasid caliphates and beyond. You see these enormous empires rising with vast trade connections, where goods are coming from the coast of China, being produced more or less in sort of cheap and cheerful factories, a bit like today, and exported to Basra and to Iraq. You find guidebooks explaining in the middle of Baghdad where the best place to buy fruit is, where the tastiest things are if you're having a nice dinner party. And their perspective in other parts of the world are much, much more global than ours. And of course, it's maybe not a surprise that in Europe, our galvanization of where Europe starts to wake up and starts to recover some of its identity, some of its wealth, some of those connections are brought by two particular routes. One is Venice, which is the gateway, not from Europe south, it's the gateway of things from the Middle East and Central Asia and beyond into Europe, and through the Vikings. The Scandinavian trade routes, the amount of silver that's brought up into the Baltic, into Finland, Sweden, and what's now Norway and Denmark, changes the European monetary economy in about the 9th and 10th centuries, and allows the Viking Age not just to conquer and colonize Iceland, Greenland, and reach Newfoundland, but to reset what those expectations are of what kings do, how they behave, what capabilities you have through the use of violence, how to adopt new technologies, and how to build institutions that have been learnt from other parts of the world. So the Vikings and the Venetians are the key gateways to understand these sophisticated, developed worlds and beyond. So, for example, 1,000 years ago, outside Constantinople, there was, I was going to say, not a single centre of learning in Europe that was worthwhile. Maybe you could look at Paris, I suppose. Maybe Bologna just starting to get going, but very, very modest. At that time, the scholarship being produced in Bukhara, in Damascus, in Merv, the largest city on earth between the 800 and 1200, in Kaifeng. These were the great centres of learning. Those were the Oxfords and Cambridge 1,000 years ago, the Harvards and the Yales, the Uppsala and the Lund University. And I think that we don't have a concept of the East, because for us it's just a world where of the conquered rather than of engagement.
Could you imagine a future where the sort of cultural center of gravity moves back again to places like Damascus and Constantinople?
Well, it depends how you want me to answer, and also depends what you want to hear. I'm a historian, so I can't guess the future. But what I can tell you is that more people live in Asia than all the other continents combined. So if you're worried about global climate change, it's probably not going to be recycling schemes in Göteborg that are going to save us. It's probably the 160 cities in China with more than 1 million population. How they use water, how they recycle, how they burn energy is going to be more significant. I think in terms of the pollution globally, of the 95% of the world's pollution to rivers is in 10 rivers, and 8 of them are in Asia. Right. So I think it's not, will Asia win and will they have now create a empire where we serve? I don't think that's a question I even recognize. But I think in terms of the competition for natural resources, for new technologies, for the world of the future, half of the world's AI specialists are now based in China. That's up from 35% 4 years ago. So here in Europe, we have 8% of the world's STEM graduates, and Asia has half. So there's nothing is predetermined in history.
But if we look back rather than forward, are there any obvious lessons from the Byzantine Empire for these rather shaky Western democracies of today, current administrations?
Yeah, you've got to be prepared for shock. You've got to be able to recognize that changes to your territory can't bring the house of cards tumbling down. You need to have institutions that protect the rule of law. You need to have meritocracy that don't let single families or individuals become over wealthy because they become a threat not just to the emperor but to the system of government. You need to be ready to cope with multilingual, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious points of view, which the Byzantines do pretty well across different geographies and climatic zones. And you've got to invest for the future. Constantinople 1,000 years ago had a population of maybe 300,000, maybe even 400,000 or 500,000, at least 10 times bigger than any other city in Europe. To make a city like that work, you need to think about water supply. The aqueduct infrastructure that supplies water, the infrastructure for cisterns, mean that success doesn't come by chance. So the lessons you learn are make sure that you're planning ahead. And to give on water, for example, we had a minister in the UK last week saying the United Kingdom, which is not a country famous for its weather, apart from its rain.
Or neither water management.
Nor water management. In 10 years' time, we will not have enough drinking water in the United Kingdom. And for a senior government minister to say that, outside an election cycle, no one's trying to get votes, that should tell us that the lack of planning and thinking ahead is critical. And when you scale that through, did we plan through in the West about the impacts of social media, the rise of China, the threat posed by Russia? I think we don't have that long-term horizon scanning that I recognize does happen in the Byzantine world. So the constant looking for information from the peripheries, what are the threats coming towards us? How do we capitalize on those? How do we use those to our advantage? Was something that the Byzantines did very well.
Yeah, and climate change is an obvious case in point. You actually devoted a whole book to that sort of subject as well. The Earth Transformed, how the natural environment has impacted human history. Just a final word on that concerning the Byzantine Empire. What role did that play during this millennium?
Well, there are two different questions. One is that in my world, the thing as a historian, in my boring job, well, not boring, I love my job, in my library-based, teaching-based job that is not public-facing, like a conversation like this, the thing that by far is moving the fastest are the ways in which science is helping us understand the past better. So the new tools we have for genetic data to show us about about death and about how people are dying, or about migration, to show us the tools we can now use to chart the spread of languages, the ways in which we can use machine learning and big data, the ways in which there's these now climate archives of looking at fossilized pollen or at tree ring data. We can reconstruct the past with such better accuracy than we could before, and with loads of data. So part of the question is what can we learn from looking at these new materials? Second, what can we look at from either extreme weather events or from long-range climate patterns? So, for example, the Roman Empire at its peak, the bit where we all recognize from Gladiator and those films, where palaces and Romans being wealthy, comes in a 200-year window where the climate of the Mediterranean and globally is extremely stable. So the Romans weren't just good administrators, they were lucky. When things start to go wrong, when you have big events like volcanic eruptions or unusually long periods of high levels of drought, which affect your harvests, yields go up or go down, prices go up. Those then get forced up by speculators and by producers who want to retain because they want to get even richer. That creates economic shock and socioeconomic pressure. And governments can sometimes crumble under that kind of pressure. And that happens with Rome. So we had a Donald Trump version. The Emperor Diocletian does something similar. He says, right, tariffs. That's how we're going to do it. And we're going to set the tariffs. Diocletian, remember Donald Trump holding up the list of every single country, including the island with penguins and no humans. Diocletian does something similar. He says, right, every single piece of footwear, I'm going to price differently. My own joy, if it's a Persian sandal that's made of this kind of leather, you're going to pay this much extra. And I think those pressures that come through economic shock always have a trigger, and climate is never the only trigger, but it can make problems worse. So, here in Europe, about 25% of our continent is water stressed. We have food prices that are already 25% higher than before the pandemic. We've got one of the worst harvests in UK for the last 50 years. I've been looking at wheat numbers and fruit production in Russia. We've had a very warm spring and then frosts in April, May that have killed lots of the fruit in Russia. So Russia's economic situation this summer is going to get worse because prices will go up and production goes down. So climate is really important to understand the realities of the nuts and bolts. Sometimes in history and history lessons, we learn about terrible people or great heroes, but the scene on which history's played out is very basic: water, food, energy, disease environments. And probably we should build up to look at structures. And so my work on the Byzantine Empire now is about what do those all look like, and when there are threats and challenges, what are happening to these really important fundamental metrics.
Wonderful. We're sadly out of time. Thank you so much, Peter Frankopan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.